The Declaration of Independence is perhaps the most influential American document for one simple reason, and that is that it's guided the way in which Americans think about the relationship between themselves and the government of the United States. We recognize that the people that wrote the Declaration, Thomas Jefferson, the other four gentlemen that were there on the Committee of Five, as well as all those who were part of the Second Continental Congress, took a great deal of time and energy into really putting together the ideas that become the Declaration so that the world understands what we as Americans think about government. The first thing we want to look at is the way in which certain things, in particular certain documents and people, influence the Declaration of Independence. This was not written in isolation, meaning that it wasn't written just off the top of Thomas Jefferson's head, or anybody else's for that matter, but in fact it was influenced by varying degrees, things that were both British as well as French, things that stretched back several hundred years, and things that were far more recent. So we look at the Magna Carta, for instance. This is probably one of the foremost influences on the Declaration. The Magna Carta was written in 1215. What the Magna Carta basically is it's a statement made by the nobles of England to their king, and it was King John was forced to sign this, as a matter of fact. But the idea is that the nobles had become very upset with what the king had done in terms of their own liberties. They had affected them in terms of taxation and in terms of putting upon them responsibilities that he himself really should have had. And so the Magna Carta, when it's written, is a clear statement that the government has limited power. The statement that basically the government cannot do, the king in this particular case, cannot do whatever it wants. And that the other part of that is, because the government has limited power, is that those in government actually must obey the laws just like everybody else. They're not above the laws as much as they might think, and certainly the King of England had this problem. Now, the English Bill of Rights, which was written in 1689, is not unlike other bills of rights. A Bill of Rights basically is a list of rights, which is pretty simple to understand. Now, these rights, unlike other rights, for instance, we'll talk about with John Locke the idea of natural rights. These rights are what we call civil rights. They're given by government, which means that government can take them away if government sees fit. Now, the best way to understand civil rights is that at the same time it gives citizens a certain number of rights that they know that they can enjoy. It must at the same time limit government's power, because if we say, for instance, you have freedom of speech, what that implies is that your government cannot limit your speech. Okay? Or if it does, has limits to the way in which it can limit it. If you have freedom of religion, the government can't turn around and tell you that you have to practice a certain religion. So every time we say that you have a certain right, we at the same time say the government can't. And that's the way in which it limits the power of government. Now, John Locke and Montesquieu were influential as far as their ideas, because many of the ideas with which these two gentlemen wrote about in the late 1600s, early 1700s, are incorporated in some cases almost directly into the Declaration of Independence. John Locke was an English philosopher who's probably best known for his ideas on natural law and therefore also natural rights. Those natural rights being rights that cannot be taken away. Natural rights were for some people believed to be given by God, and you actually see a reference to that in the Declaration of Independence. Those natural rights, life, liberty, and as Locke said, property. It's the job of government, John Locke said, to protect natural rights. And the Declaration makes that statement pretty clear. At the same time, if we want our government to do that, what we recognize throughout history is that government has a great tendency to do just the opposite, to attack natural rights, to go after people's property, to lock people up indiscriminately, to make sure that people, if they don't obey the law, are punished, in some cases to the extreme of being killed, so attacking their lives. And so Montesquieu wanted to write about something that was in relation to John Locke, but not exactly the same thing. He says, well, how can we make sure that our government does exactly what John Locke says government should do? And that is protect natural rights. Well, Montesquieu says the best way to do this is to separate the powers. By separating the powers of government, Montesquieu says, we don't allow that concentration of power that usually results in tyranny, or it results in an abuse of power, in other words. And so Montesquieu points out that we need to separate powers into three branches or parts: the legislative, the executive, and the judicial. You should know what each one of those does. But by separating out the powers, we prevent then government doing exactly what we fear government will do, and that is that they'll begin to attack our natural rights and prevent us from enjoying our lives, from living in a sense of safety and happiness, which is what the Declaration also refers to. The next thing we want to look at is the who, the when, and the where. We understand that Thomas Jefferson is the man who did the writing for the Declaration, but there should also be an understanding that there is this group called the Committee of Five. So Thomas Jefferson is one of five individuals. The other four individuals serve basically as editors. He comes back to them with the writing. They are going to direct him to change some words, to rephrase some things, to pull some ideas out, to put some ideas in. And this process takes pretty much the month of June of 1776. When it's all done and it's all voted on, sometime between July 2nd and July 4th, the date of July 4th is put on the document as the date in which it was approved. Signing doesn't happen until the end of August. It has to go off and be printed. The whole process takes place in the room you see here on the screen. This room is in fact a room that we refer to as the room where the Second Continental Congress met. You can see a duplicate of this room actually at Knott's Berry Farm in Orange County. And this building that is seen here in the picture, this is what we refer to now as Independence Hall. So this is where it happened. Now the building itself was actually the Pennsylvania State House. It was where the legislative branch of Pennsylvania met. And when the war starts, the First Continental Congress meets there, the Second Continental Congress meets there. And eventually it gets renamed because of the fact that the Declaration of Independence is written by the men that attended the Second Continental Congress, and then it is actually voted on and approved in that same building, and now it's a national landmark. The purposes of the Declaration of Independence are clearly stated in the preamble. Now the preamble itself, if you notice it, is actually one sentence. So it's one big giant long sentence. But the Declaration has a very clear purpose. First of all, it says that the purpose is to dissolve the political bands which have connected us with another, meaning separating ourselves from Great Britain. The second purpose seems to be that we need to, out of a decent respect for the opinions of mankind, we should explain the reason why we're actually separating. And so the Declaration seeks to, number one, state that we want to be independent, and number two, to explain why it is we think we can be independent. Most of that argument about why we think we should be independent is based upon the laws of nature and of nature's God. And notice it says here that we feel entitled to this separation because of the laws of nature. And so when we talked about on the previous screen the idea of natural rights and natural law, this is something we need to just take a moment to explain so that it's very clear, otherwise you're not going to understand what exactly is the argument based on. How it is it that we think that we have this right to a revolution? At first, let's talk about natural law. Natural laws can best be described as laws that are universal and unchanging. Now, this makes sense if you're looking at it from the point of view that this is something that comes from nature's God. Universal and unchanging. What does that mean exactly? Well, it means that, for instance, these laws we're about to talk about, these are laws that universally are accepted by people around the world. And they're laws that not just are accepted now by people around the world, but they're unchanging, which means they've always been accepted by people around the world. What kind of laws? You go to any country in the world, you're going to find out that, guess what? Murder's wrong. Murder's just simply not acceptable. So murder is an example. of something that is not allowed. Now we can continue building the list, and we can talk about things like cheating, for instance, or stealing, and so on. Being faithful, okay, not lying, in other words. But whenever we talk about these natural laws, and by the way, Thomas Jefferson's going to go so far as to say that having your own government is also a natural law. The idea is that it completely correlates or connects with the idea of natural rights. Rights that are given to people that cannot be taken away. They're given by, in what the Declaration refers to as given by the Creator. But understand the connection here. If there's a law that says that you can't murder, well then obviously it implies that there is a right to life. The law that says, for instance, you can't steal implies that there's a right to property. At the same time, Thomas Jefferson's going to make the argument, if there's a law that says that people should be allowed to make their own decisions, to live their lives in a way that they choose, then there must be a right to liberty. And this is the connection between natural law and natural rights that is really very necessary to understand in order to understand the argument that Thomas Jefferson is going to make for us having our own government. In the second paragraph of the Declaration, you're going to find a list of what I refer to as the self-evident truths of the Declaration. And those self-evident truths kind of spell out the logical thought process by which Thomas Jefferson goes from saying, look, we want this, and here's the reason why we can have this. First of all, he says that all men are created equal. Now, it's really kind of important to understand that created here implies something very strongly. And that is that we all start off the same. We all start off in the same way. We're all made the same. It doesn't guarantee we all end up the same. There's no guarantee here that all men will have the same kind of things when they get to be a certain age, or access to the same things. It implies simply this: we all start the same way. Now, what happens to us as time goes on depends upon what we do in our lives, how much education we get, for instance. It also involves perhaps a little bit of luck, and that is, do we inherit a large sum of money from some relative? Do we happen to live in a place that is filled with natural resources that we can use to benefit ourselves? These kinds of circumstances are going to determine where we end up, but where we start is the same place as everybody else. Now, that phrase, all men are created equal, causes a lot of consternation among some people. As a matter of fact, it was what leads to in a large part because of the social circumstances, but also because of the way it's phrased, it leads to the Declaration of Sentiments in the 1800s, where women get together and say, all men and women are created equal. My understanding of the Declaration is that the phrase here, all men, is very similar to the phrase, all mankind, which would refer to all people, not just simply men. Now, it says further into the Declaration, all men are created equal, and that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights. So all of them have rights. And that word unalienable means that they cannot be taken away. It also goes on to say that among those rights, and notice it says among, inferring that there is in fact other rights besides the ones about to be mentioned. But among those rights are the rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Now, Thomas Jefferson opts for pursuit of happiness over property for a simple reason. First of all, property is something that is understood in 1776 as land, dirt. This is not what he wants to have stated. He knows that some people just don't own land, and that's a problem. So instead he writes pursuit of happiness. But what makes you happy? Think about what makes you happy. Those things, for instance, in your life, those things like your family. Okay, my family makes me happy. My home makes me happy. My children, my wife, my dog. But they're mine. They're almost like property in a sense. These are things that are deeply personal, and this is what makes us truly happy. Things that belong solely to us, not to other people. That's what makes us happy. Now, the government gets its power from the people, the Declaration says, and the government's job is to protect the natural rights of the people that it gets the power from. Ultimately, people have the right to revolution if and only if the government doesn't protect the natural rights. And this is one of those stipulations that's so vitally important to recognize, is that you don't just have the right to revolution because. You have the right to revolution when you actually can demonstrate that over a long period of time, there's been a continual violation of natural rights, and that you've done everything that you can to correct that violation. And at that point, you feel like you can't go any further. At that point, you have the right to revolution. Now, at the end of that second paragraph, there is a clear statement that goes a little bit further. Jefferson says that it's not just their right, it's their duty to throw off such government. That if at the same time we get to the point where we recognize that our rights are being violated, we can't rely upon somebody else to do it for us. It's our responsibility to take care of it. If somebody else does it for us, we're not going to value it the same way as if we took care of it ourselves. This is no different, for instance, than being given something. You don't show respect for that thing as much as if you had to go out and buy it and pay for it yourself. If you had to work hard to provide the money for it, you would take better care of it. Just think of, for instance, a car. We rent cars, we tend to abuse them. When we buy cars, we tend to take care of them. And so the fact that we've sacrificed for it, the result is that we value it more. And this is the reason why he says that it's our responsibility. It's not somebody else's to do this for us. The Declaration ends with this statement. And for support of this declaration, with a firm reliance on the protection of divine providence, we mutually pledge to each other our lives, our fortunes, and our sacred honor. What's really significant here is to recognize something. They are pledging that they're willing to sacrifice their lives. They are recognizing that they must give up perhaps their fortunes. That is all but the money they've made. This perhaps, however, is the greatest sacrifice that they'll make. They're willing to risk their reputation as individuals. For how long? Sacred here implies for an eternity. They're willing to risk that for all eternity they will be recognized or seen by other people as perhaps being as low can be, as being evil, for the sake of making sure that this declaration is fulfilled, that in fact we get our independence. That's an incredible sacrifice. That's much more than perhaps other people would be willing to give. But the duty here suggests that, in fact, if you're not willing to give up your life and your fortune and your sacred honor for liberty, then you're not going after it for the right reason. And you're probably not going after it in the right way. You may be motivated by the wrong things. And ultimately because you're not willing to sacrifice those things. When you get it, you probably are going to lose it. It's probably not going to stick. It's probably going to fade away rather quickly. The difference between our revolution and so many others is that the men who started the revolution, they knew clearly what they wanted. They knew clearly why they wanted it. They knew clearly and could argue clearly why they should have it. And ultimately, they were willing to sacrifice everything for it. But the reality is this, going back to that idea of duty. If you do not maintain it, if you do not continually go back to those ideas that are central to the Declaration, these self-evident truths, and you don't remind yourselves and you don't remind each generation that these are the things that Americans believe are right about government, the relationship between government and people. These things need to be something that we are reminded of frequently in order to make sure that we maintain the liberty that we have and that we don't lose it despite the sacrifice of so many lives, so much fortune, and at the same time perhaps some sacred honor for some individuals. Ultimately, 56 men signed the Declaration. 9 of them fought and died in the Revolution. However, many of them lost their lives and fortunes. But the reality is, because of the sacrifice they made, they're forever honored as Americans.